Welcome to 2819. This is the show where we aim to inspire you to make disciples of all nations. I'm Sandra Dimas.
And I'm Brian Rollenbacher, and this is the television outreach of Reasons to Believe, a viewer-supported ministry where science and faith converge.
And you know, speaking of being viewer-supported, we really need some viewers to support us. If you enjoy this show, please visit reasons.org/2819.
You can also support us by subscribing on YouTube. So if you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button below. And we just want you to stay up to date on all the new videos RTB is producing, and maybe even think about sharing some of those.
And you know, if you want to connect with us on social media, see what we're up to, even behind the scenes stuff, find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're at 2819 Show.
And if you want to get the podcast version of 2819, we're on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and now on Spotify. Check those out. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast.
And now it's time for a quick rundown of what you'll see in this episode. In our Nexus segment, Abdu Murray from Ravi Zacharias International Ministries will address the question, how can we be culturally aware when engaging Muslims? Such an important conversation to be aware of the cultural differences.
Definitely. But in Culture Talk, you're going to be talking about something that I find fascinating, UFOs.
Yeah.
Well, not just UFOs, but she'll be interviewing Mark Clark, who is a national security expert, about the Christian perspective on UFOs and how to rationally talk about that with unbelievers.
Yeah. In our Give and Take segment, Dr. Fazale Rana will sit down with Dr. Jeff Zweerink to answer the question, does life's origin require God?
First up, we have RTB 101. Chris is going to be interviewing astrophysicist Dr. Jeff Zweerink, asking the question, why do so many scientists oppose creation? Let's check that out.
Now it's time for RTB 101. This is the segment where we talk about practical questions to help train you to share your faith with friends and family more effectively. Now, research says the more education someone has, the more likely they are to believe in evolution. So does that mean that in order to be a credible scientist, you must oppose creation? Here to help me talk about this important question is physicist Dr. Jeff Zweerink. Welcome, Jeff.
Hi, Krista. It's good to be here.
Now, normally you're over there on the couches with the other scholars and you're the host, but you are a physicist.
I am an astrophysicist, technically.
Okay,
but
okay.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. So I thought you'd be a great person to talk about this question with because you are a physicist, astrophysicist, but you're also a serious Christian, not like an in-name-only Christian. Like, you really believe the Bible and Jesus and all the things. So do you find it to be a difficult fit for those two worlds to go together in an authentic way?
And honestly, no, I don't. What I love about them, I mean, in some sense, Christianity and science are my two passions in life. If the Bible's true, I want to believe that. If what science tells us about the world's true, I want to believe that. So I actually find they really do work together. Although I did struggle when I was first learning that because it is presented as though you've got this separate two worlds you have to live in.
Yeah, and then you've got to go through some kind of mental gymnastics in order to live as a person. Like maybe I'm a scientist 6 days a week and I'm a Christian on Sunday. But for you, that's more cohesive.
It really is. And what I've realized is that there's ways Christians can talk about what you have to do to be a scientist that are opposed to Christianity. And there's ways scientists talk about Christianity that oppose to the truth. And if you listen to those, then yeah, you've got to live with that tension. But if you understand what Christianity is really about, it's about knowing the truth, because the truth will set you free. And if you understand what science is about, it's about studying creation and figuring out what's true and how it works. They're both pursuing truth. And so I find it very coherent to be a Christian and a scientist looking to understand how things work.
Now, in your role as a research scientist, I'm curious, like, do you feel like you're just sort of the lone wolf out there, you know, like there's 3 of you on the planet that feel this way? Or do you feel like there's a good community of Christians who also are engaged in science?
My experience is there's been Christians everywhere I worked at. When I was an undergraduate, graduate at Iowa State, the chairman of the physics department was a Christian. My major professor was a Christian. There were other people who I still get devotional work who are prominent Christians in the department. Virtually every place I've worked, there have been Christians in the department, some more outspoken, some more soft-spoken, some more committed, some less committed. You know, really it does match what I find in the rest of the community that I interact with outside of science. There's really not a lot of difference. What I do find in the scientific community is that people tend to be a lot more definitive of what their views are. And so there's a little less middle ground, if you will.
Okay. Do you think that makes a difference based on what discipline of science you're in? Like you as a physicist, astrophysicist, mathematician, is it more okay to be a Christian in those realms than maybe some of the other sciences?
I think it's certainly a lot easier. I mean, I just think of all the classes I took in college, and if you're talking about specifically about evolution, there was one physics class I had where somebody referenced evolution. It just never came up. We're talking about how do stars work, how do things fall, statistics. I mean, all sorts of
calculus.
Things. Yeah, and it's like at some level, F equals MA, whatever your religious view is on things. And so, but I know if you get into the biological realm, that's going to be more central to what the view is of how people look at things. And so that's going to play in more there. And, if you get into astrophysics, there's a little bit more if you're dealing with cosmology, less so just dealing with high energy gamma rays, which is what I did most of my work on. And so, yeah, it really does, I think, each discipline, and even within certain disciplines like physics, chemistry, biology, even some of the sub-disciplines are going to be maybe a little bit more antagonistic or hospitable to Christian thought.
So along those lines, then I'm imagining that if I have a non-Christian friend who's scientifically literate, they might have some concerns that being a Christian who's working in life sciences, let's say, or cosmology, that could actually end up being like a science stopper. Like if a Christian's working in that area, maybe they don't probe very deep because all they have to do is just say, well, I'm kind of stuck right here, so God must have done something.
I don't know any scientists worth their salt who would do that. That's just a lazy man's way. The reason why scientists get into this is because they're fascinated with the way things work and what can they figure out. And so, I mean, even going back 30, 40 years when I was just getting into science and undergraduate, kind of the Big Bang was the boundary. We didn't know how to look beyond that or even probe beyond that. Well, that was Christian, non-Christian alike. Well, now we have some tools that allow us to maybe explore beyond that. And so what was a boundary where we just had to say, we don't have the technology or the ability to explore, people have been working on for 30, 40 years, and now we've got some tools in there. And so what I would say is you can be lazy no matter what your worldview is. But by and large, most scientists are saying, hey, what can I figure out about this? And if they run into a place where there's a wall, they're going to look and say, well, maybe there's a different way I could approach this. Or maybe I'll just go look somewhere else for a while because that problem that's intractable now is going to be more tractable a decade or so later. And so they're going to find some way to get around that.
So what I hear you saying kind of is two things. One is that it's a bad stereotype about scientists who are Christians, that their belief system or their worldview is going to be a science stopper. That's just a bad stereotype.
Yes.
Whereas in the real world of science, scientists by nature are naturally curious. They want to probe. And they're not going to allow their faith to really come up as a barrier.
Well, and even more than that, I mean, historically, if you look, you go back to a lot of the earlier scientists, the Bacons and the Maxwells, they were trying to figure out how God created and the world operates. They were looking to understand what God had been doing. And so their faith actually drove them to do the exploration, not the other. The faith didn't say, well, we can't explore that because that's God's domain. And so it really historically has been a very different picture, but practically speaking, even today, it's a very different picture.
Very good. I want to encourage all of you, if you haven't yet done so, go get connected to Jeff's blog. You can go on our website, reasons.org, and search for Impact Events. Now we're going to hear from our friend Abdu Murray. He's talking about the question, how can Christians be culturally aware when engaging with Muslims? Let's check that out.
What are some topics that maybe we don't want to emphasize right out of the chute? What are some cultural things that we should be sensitive about as we approach Muslims?
Well, that is really the question in terms of engagement and how we do it. How we do it is as important as what we're saying. And one of the first things we have to be careful of is some of the social issues, some of the social ways we interact. For example, a man approaching a woman, maybe she's got a hijab on or whatever it is, and start asking her questions alone, one-on-one, or even in public, but you're one-on-one. That's considered sometimes to be offensive because it's like, well, we don't approach that way. That's considered almost like an advance. And that would never be treated with any kind of welcoming attitude. Now you've got her defensive or whatever it might be. Conversely, same thing. A woman who's not a Muslim approaching a Muslim man and beginning to sort of corner him or talk to him in a one-on-one area, he might consider this inappropriate, both from her end and his own end. So now you're not going to have a discussion. What you're going to have is an awkward sort of encounter where they can't wait to get out of the situation. So be careful of the intermingling of the genders. It's very important that we make sure we do that. And another very important thing is to not sort of right out of the box start talking about Muhammad and bad things and what you hear in the media and all these things. There's a time and a place to have these tough discussions, but right out of the box is not one of them. You're going to build a wall immediately because of their reverence and love for Muhammad. And if we start to say things that we think are false about his life or whatever it might be, we're going to end up building a wall, not a bridge.
I mean, it would be equivalent to somebody insulting Jesus.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that wouldn't get us talking in a real discussion. That would get us to, sort of put up our dukes, as it were. And you don't want to have that happen. So those are two of the most important, I think, aspects of the engagement we need to have, is that we don't rush into this. But a third, and I think very important one, because it's so subtle, is don't make assumptions about the Muslim you're talking to. Just because they ascribe to Islam in a cultural sense or say, I'm a Muslim by identity, doesn't mean they actually believe it with any real convictions. I've had many a conversation with people who would self-identify as a Muslim, but actually have very serious doubts about God's existence in general. Or they have very serious problems with, is God good, because of circumstances in their own lives, whatever it might be. So don't make some assumptions. Don't make assumptions that if you go into the history of the Quran or the history of the Bible or whatever it might be, that they're going to be interested in that. They might have other things they're more interested in that will be compelling inroads to get them to see Jesus afresh. So don't make assumptions, because they're as varied as there are Muslims. So don't make assumptions that way as well. But also don't be afraid to point out differences in the belief systems. They know there are differences. They expect there to be differences. And if you whitewash the differences too much, they will think that you're not a good Christian or that you don't even believe what you're saying. Why should they believe it? So they're okay with differences. They won't shatter into a billion pieces if we point out that there are differences between Islam and Christianity. They won't. They expect there to be differences. They acknowledge them, and in fact, they'll point them out to you pretty fast if you don't. So don't be afraid to talk about that, or Jesus being the Son of God and the Trinity and all these things. Be willing to talk about those things. Don't treat your Bible, by the way, irreverently. Don't put it on the floor. Don't let it sit down dust covered or whatever it might be. They revere the Quran as God's word. They expect you to do the same with the Bible. And if they don't see you doing that, they won't take you seriously.
If you'd like to hear more from Abdu Murray and other visiting scholars, visit reasons.org and search for our Voices blog. Now it's time for Culture Talk. This is a segment where we talk about the intersection of science, faith, and pop culture, and how culturally relevant topics can be used to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined with Dr. Mark Clark. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sandra.
You are a professor and a national securities expert, and we're going to be talking about something, a TV show actually.
Yes.
It's called Project Blue Book.
Yes.
And I know that you have some familiarity with this book. So first, the premise of the show, it's dealing with people who claim to have UFO sightings. Mm-hmm. And so Project Blue Book is a collection of these reports
yes.
of UFO sightings.
Yep.
So let me ask the expert, what is your experience with Project Blue Book?
So it's interesting. Until I heard Hugh Ross mention Project Blue Book, I had never heard of it. And I served in the Marines in the 70s, and I was in National Guard for about 7 years. But it was kind of after I heard him on a seminar that I first heard of it, and I thought, what is Project Blue Book? So I began to look at it. Mm-hmm. And then a few, probably years later, my only exposure to any of this is I love science fiction movies. Mm-hmm. So I began to examine it, and when I found out what it was an Air Force research project designed to answer the questions by a lot of people. Hey, we've seen something, we can't explain it, can you explain it? And they, over the course of, I think, almost 20 years, recorded over 12,500 reported sightings. Mm-hmm. They could resolve all but about 700 of them. This story, Project Blue Book, the History Channel story, is kind of centered on the character J. Allen Hynek, a reluctant astrophysicist that gets involved with this project. Mm-hmm. But I really didn't have any exposure to it until we decided to do this book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, and it was Hugh, Ken, and I decided to do this in the late 90s, and I think our publication came out in the early 2000s.
Right. And just to give people a background, so you actually held clearances. So you're not just a guy who's interested in sci-fi films, right?
No, exactly. Yeah, no, I do hold clearances, but more of what I do is kind of at the university, train people and students to go into national security of all kinds, intelligence and government accountability office and things like that.
So can you kind of delve into some of these natural explanations for UFO sightings? What are those?
Sure. So it's really kind of interesting. Out of the 12,500, only 700 were not explainable. The vast majority can be explained by some other phenomena. And I'll give you 2 examples from my own life, which I think are interesting. In November 8th of 2015, my wife and I and her brother were going down to our friend's house in Laguna to celebrate an early Thanksgiving dinner. And for those of you not familiar with California, it's a long freeway commute, a lot of traffic, but it was towards dusk, and it was so strange because before we got into Orange County, we could see something odd looking out and about my thumb's length at that distance in the night sky, and it was a bright blue object, and it was conically shaped. It was a conical, like a cone. And at first we looked at it and thought, is that a helicopter? Is it flashing lights? But we couldn't make no sense of it. I'd never seen a blue light before. And it lasted probably 2 to 3 minutes, and we had no explanation for it. But then, pretty quickly, it burst into something almost like the size of a volleyball in the night sky of blue light. And it was diffused around the edges, and it was bright, and it looked like it was hovering. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it was not moving, and we could not figure it out. Now, we're in Southern California, and, Vandenberg Air Force Base is probably 100 miles northwest of us from here. And I've seen, the Air Force there will often test international or intercontinental ballistic missiles. And I've seen those tests, but at this angle, you could see the rocket or the contrail from the rocket. This you couldn't tell or see, so it couldn't have been Vandenberg, so I had no explanation. Well, we flipped on the radio, and sure enough, everyone's reporting in UFO sightings, right? And what's going on? And they're calling the local police, the media, sheriff's department. The next day, the U.S. Navy reported that it had launched a test of its Trident II D5 submarine-launched ballistic missile off our west coast. And it makes perfect sense, because if it was right off our coast and the angle was exactly that way towards the Kwajalein Atoll, we would have seen the rear end of this. And so when that bloom occurred, it was probably a stage separation that occurred, and that's what produced this appearance of a ball of light. Because we couldn't see contrails, it was still dark and all that.
So there are definitely natural explanations for, and we might not know because it's technology that is not really public knowledge. But there are natural explanations for almost all of the sightings. But you said that there were some that there weren't natural explanations for. So what are those?
Yes. So what's interesting is that, again, Project Blue Book did this, and all of our studies, Ken, Hugh, and I, discovered that at least 95% can be explained naturally. But there is this residual amount, 1 to 5%, that defy explanation. And so we call those RUFOs, or residual UFO phenomena. And what's interesting is they display what we call real but non-physical properties. So what do I mean by real but non-physical? Well, real in the sense that multiple people see something, but if it crashes, they go to the crash site and there's no evidence. Or it supposedly landed in another place and there's no evidence that it landed. So what we discovered along the way is that there is this residual amount. And what we've discovered is everyone that's reported them has an open door to the occult. And that could be from something as innocent as attending a slumber party when they were young, reading of an astrologer, or of seeking the help of a medium, or maybe tarot cards, or things like that. And so there is this open door to the occult that we have to be concerned with. And there seems to be a one-to-one correspondence with those who have observed this phenomena, this residual phenomena.
And so you mentioned sleepover. You mean not just sleeping over someone's house, but using a Ouija board at these sleepovers. Which is unfortunately like kind of a thing that...
Common. Yeah. Well, I have a friend who actually said, she just told me this recently, that she actually engaged in levitation and it worked and it scared her. And so she renounced interest in it because of that. As if something like that. So
this is a really fascinating topic. And I know there are so many people who, they love sci-fi, but that piques an interest in and getting excited about the existence of aliens and UFOs. So for Christians, if they're fascinated by UFOs, how can we talk to them about this topic?
Sure. I would say 2 things for the Christian. The first is get prepared to understand this. Probably a first step would be to read our book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. The whole book gives you a lot of evidence to deal with. The second thing I would encourage Christians to do is is to speak gently and respectfully to people who either have a friend, because 50% of us probably believe in this, right? Or of all Americans. So some of us are going to know people that are engaged in this or have believed it or have heard someone that has. So we have to be respectful and develop mutual trust.
Right.
And if you develop that, what you can do is in the kind of towards the end of our book, there's a whole section on how you can close the door to the occult, but open the door to the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Thank you so much. If you want to hear more from Dr. Mark Clark, Ken Samples, and Hugh Ross, be sure to check out their excellent resource, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. Now we're going to head to Give and Take, where Jeff Zweerink will talk with Dr. Fazale Rana about the question, does life's origin require God? Let's check it out.
Hello, Jeff Zweerink here with Give and Take. Thank you for joining us today. This is the segment of the show where we look at important scientific ideas to help equip you to be more confident in sharing the gospel. Today I'm joined by my friend and colleague Faz Rana, and we're going to ask the question, does the origin of life require God's activity? Faz, it's good to have you here again today.
Thanks, Jeff.
So this is a fairly complicated topic. Lots of things go into the origin of life research, and it's one where people have been looking for a long time and there's still a lot of work left. So can you just kind of lay out the structure? What are some of the things that are going on there? How do we think about origin of life research in general?
Yeah. Well, and as you point out, the origin of life is one of the big questions in science today, and one of the outstanding questions in science. And, you know, unfortunately, origin of life researchers can't time travel and observe what happened. And they can get some insight from the geochemical record and the fossil record, but when you're going that far back in Earth's history, 3.8 billion years ago, there's really a dearth of evidence that they have to guide them from the geological record and the fossil record. So they're forced to go into the lab and carry out laboratory experiments where they're trying to simulate different steps or stages in the origin of life process, trying to understand how simple molecules can become more complex, and then how those more complex molecules can interact to form these chemical supersystems that begin to assume the properties of life.
So part of the challenge here, if you will, is that one, this just happened a long time ago. I mean, almost 4 billion years ago. But the other problem is that there's just not a lot of signatures left of what was going on then, and most of this would have been pretty primitive life, which doesn't leave fossils, those sorts of things, correct? So the only way to do this is in the lab, but presumably this takes quite a bit of time. And how do you, so this is kind of the scenario of how do you actually delve in and figure out what's going on when you don't have a lot of record of what the life was doing at the time?
That's right, yes.
So in that context, what are the areas of people are looking at in hopes of figuring out what went on at the origin?
Yeah, well, when people are going in the lab and they're doing laboratory experiments, really one of the first questions that they would ask is a particular chemical or physical process possible to convert one compound, let's say, into another compound that would contribute to the origin of life process? So it's kind of like a proof of principle experiment.
Okay, so this is a sort of thing like the Miller-Urey experiment, if you will, where we need amino acids. Can we do something maybe like the early Earth that would produce amino acids?
That's right, yeah. And then the second step would be what exactly is going on mechanistically? What's really controlling that process? How does that process work? Trying to dissect that.
Okay.
And so these are mechanistic studies. And I would say that when it comes to the origin of life question, both the proof of principle and the mechanistic studies have been places where origin of life researchers have been really highly successful. Okay. They've demonstrated in principle that there's a number of chemical and physical processes that could, in principle, contribute to the origin of life. They understand mechanistically what's controlling these processes. Then the third goal is to try to then show that these processes are geochemically relevant. That is, that they would actually happen on the early Earth, that they could translate from the lab to the early Earth's environment.
So that's the distinction between those two, is one, does this work in the lab and might it actually contribute to life? Right. And the other is, would that actually have occurred on the early Earth?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and this is where I think that the Origin of Life program has really struggled, where there really is, if I would dare say, failure on the part of Origin of Life researchers is demonstrating what I would say geochemical relevance to.
So why the failure? What's going on there?
Well, this is the irony, and that is that to get these chemical processes to work in the lab, to get these physical processes to work in the lab, it requires chemists, intelligent agents, to set up the experiment. Now, of course, you're not going to have an experiment if the researcher isn't involved. But the point is that there are many experiments where the researcher is not just simply facilitating the experiment, but has actually played an integral part in the outcome of the experiment. And so, in other words, they've gone in and they've set up these highly unrealistic, carefully controlled conditions where they're very carefully adjusting the temperature and the pressure. They're maintaining that temperature and pressure through exquisite control. They're adding the right materials at the right times and the right concentrations. They're stopping the reaction at the right time. And all of this activity is actually contributing to the successful outcome of the experiment. So in other words, the researchers themselves have become part of the experimental design, but many times the researchers aren't aware that they've actually are a contributing factor to the outcome of the experiment.
You know, it's interesting you describe it that way, because the way it's often portrayed is, you know, you go into the lab, you set up these kind of very basic experiments, let them run, and you get the stuff that life, you know, the building blocks of life, if you will. What you're describing is a much more finicky procedure, it sounds like. Not that you just kind of throw things together and you end up getting life's blocks. It's like you have to pretty carefully craft and make sure everything works. Am I getting accurately what you're saying?
You're exactly right with that. And what's interesting is Origin of Life researchers are beginning to recognize that human intervention is actually a serious problem in the design of their experiments and how they would interpret the results. So it very well may be that a particular chemical process could take place in the lab that in principle could contribute to the origin of life, but would never be productive on the conditions of the early Earth just because of chemical contaminants and interfering materials, because of the uncontrolled physical environment on the early Earth. The concentrations may be way too dilute.
So if you take out the chemist who's making sure everything is set up so that it works, the reaction doesn't work.
Exactly.
Which means it doesn't apply to the early Earth because there's no chemist there, presumably, to make sure it works properly.
And that this problem is pervasive. It's not just, an experiment here or an experiment there where that's the case. It is really pervasive in the entire discipline. And again, it's interesting to see that Origin of Life researchers are really beginning to recognize this as a real problem. And to me, this is not only calls into question the relevance of work in prebiotic chemistry, but it really begins to point to, I think, a provocative theological point that really a mind seems to be required to bring about the origin of life.
You know, that's just fascinating, Fuzz. I appreciate your comments and your insights there. You know, when we look at the origin of life, that provides some of the most powerful evidence, in my opinion, that God was involved in starting life here on Earth. And we see that as the chemists go in and work to figure out how these reactions work in the lab. You take the chemist away and they don't work. And by analogy, I think we see the same thing, that if God is not there in the early Earth, life is not going to happen either. I would encourage you to go check out Fuzz's blog. It's called Prebiotic Chemistry and the Hand of God, which you can find at reasons.org, to better equip yourself to go out and share these fascinating scientific discoveries so that you can share the gospel.
That does it for us this week on 2819. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'm happy that Mark Clark didn't get arrested for talking about national security.
I know. And we hope that this episode has inspired you to go out and to share your faith with someone new, and to do so with confidence and compassion.
And if you want to support resources like this show, please visit reasons.org/2819.
And don't forget, get connected with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're at 2819 Show. We're on there. We want to hear from you.
See you all next week.